Hey everybody, in this video I've got 5 books that I definitely think you should consider adding to your summer reading list. I've chosen each of these books because they had a significant impact on my own teaching practice, and they range from bigger picture ideas all the way to classroom implementation. All right, this first book is A Brief History of the Future of Education by Ian Jukes and Ryan Schaff. And the book is subtitled Learning in the Age of Disruption. And although that might make you think that it's about teaching in the COVID era, this book was actually published in 2019. So when they say disruption, they're actually referring to the societal changes that are taking place due to machine learning, artificial intelligence, all that kind of stuff. And really the big picture idea of the book is that the world is changing, and that means that the world of education needs to change along with it. One thing I really like about this book is that the authors just aren't afraid to tell it like it is. One example of that is how they openly call out the disconnect between school and the real world as a major cause of student disengagement. They also break down the exact ways that technology is changing our relationship with information and knowledge. And I think it's those parts in particular that build an almost indisputable case for why it's so important to incorporate technology in education. The book also gets into why it's so difficult to break free from traditional mindsets, and the authors are actually quite sympathetic with the idea that it can be really hard to make a change. But it's also very much an urgent call to do things differently so that we make sure we reach today's learners. And it wouldn't be that much of a stretch to say that this book has almost become like my personal manifesto in terms of the way I think about innovation and education and why it's so important. So this next book is UDL and Blended Learning by Katie Novak and Caitlin Tucker. Both authors are experts in their fields and both have written lots of other books, but this is the first time they've ever written a book together. So like the last book, this book is also about the need to redesign education. But whereas the last book was more about why change needs to happen, this book is more about how we can actually pull it off. Really, the big idea in this book is that the answer to the question, how do we redesign education, is universal design for learning, and that the only way to effectively implement UDL is through blended learning. In the book, the authors really build this case for universal design for learning as a solution to addressing the reality of learner variability. The idea here is that traditional one-size-fits-all education is really based on kind of like a fantasy that's never actually existed. A world where students all have the same motivations, the same interests, are all at the same skill level. Instead, we should anticipate that students are going to have different needs, and that's really where UDL steps in. And because UDL is about offering students choice, providing multiple ways to access the content, making accessibility tools available to everyone, they also argue that that's basically impossible to do unless you're implementing blended learning. And blended learning is really just another way of saying choosing to use technology when it makes sense to do so. This book really helped give me a new perspective about universal design for learning, that it's not so much about reaching an end goal as it is about a mindset. It's a way of thinking about how we can continually try to reduce barriers to learning by creating all these different entry points when we're planning our lessons. I highly recommend it. It's a great book that really clarifies what UDL is about and why it's so important. All right, next on the list, we have Essential Questions by Jay McTighe and Grant Wiggins. They're both also the authors of Understanding by Design, which is about backwards planning. The idea here is that most of us plan in a forwards design way, where we're coming up with the activities first and then determining the assessment after we've already planned the activities. But with backwards design, we would want to come up with the assessment and then plan backwards from that assessment. But it's also, of course, a little bit more than just like backwards planning from a test. It's thinking about the enduring understanding we want students to take away from a lesson, and then, of course, how students would actually be showing their understanding. This book has really helped clarify for me what's meant by the term learning goals. So I think before I used to think that learning goals were really just standards or the skills that I was going to teach students. So I might backwards plan from knowing that I needed to teach students how to make an inference or how to write a complex sentence. But this book really helped clarify for me that what we should really be focusing on in backwards design is enduring understanding. And in the book, they're arguing that the most effective way to do this is by using essential questions. One thing they point out in the book is that essential questions are not just for literature or history teachers. You can create these open-ended, intellectually stimulating questions in any subject matter, and you can use them with with really any age group. And one thing I found really valuable about the book is that they just give tons of different examples of what those essential questions might look like. Sometimes I think it can be easy to overemphasize the role technology plays when we're thinking about innovation in education, but this book really clarifies that unless the content itself is interesting, none of that really matters. The whole purpose of using essential questions is to create an intellectually stimulating environment so that we can develop students' critical thinking skills. And in the next book, The Power of Making Thinking Visible by Mark Church and Ron Richer, they go over the different practices, or what they refer to as thinking routines, that we can use to help cultivate students' critical thinking skills. The authors of this book are also a part of Project Zero at Harvard School of Education, which is all about studying the impact of these different thinking routines. The big idea of this book is really just that critical thinking is a teachable skill, something that we can break down into small parts and that we can actually routinize and have students practice over and over again. What makes this book stand out from others is that although there's a big idea, there's kind of a theory here, it also shows us exactly how we would implement those ideas in a very clear step-by-step manner. And the whole idea, even with the thinking routines, is that they're supposed to be very easy to learn and easy to remember. It's quite possible you've even used some of the core thinking routines like See, Think, Wonder, or Connect, Extend, Challenge without even knowing that those were thinking routines. The idea in this book that we can break critical thinking down into bite-sized pieces, into routines that are easy to implement and that get students to really practice building this muscle of how to think critically, is something that's influenced my teaching more than pretty much any other idea that I've heard out there. And it's also influenced the way that I coach people, because it gives me something very tangible that I can refer to when we're looking at how we can enhance someone's practice. So The Power of Making Thinking Visible, I highly recommend that you check out this book or their earlier one, Making Thinking Visible. And seriously, if you implemented just a few of the ideas in this book, it would have a serious transformational impact on your classroom. The fifth book is The Google Infused Classroom by Holly Clark and Tanya Averett. And this is the updated, newly revised version of the book. The subtitle to this book is A Guidebook to Making Thinking Visible and Amplifying Student Voice. So there's a clear connection between the previous book and this one. And in this book, the big idea is that the most powerful way for us to use technology is to use it to help make student thinking visible. So the authors do actually cover some of the same thinking routines that are written about in the original book, Making Thinking Visible, but they also suggest their own unique technology integrated routines. This book does refer to specific technology applications, but the emphasis is much more on what we should be doing with those technology tools, not on the specific tech tool that you choose. It's not an over-exaggeration to say that I literally had a copy of the original version of this book on my desk and used it on almost a daily basis when I was planning my lessons. It's literally chock full of all these awesome ways that we can be using technology tools. And I can say without hesitation that this book, more than any other, had probably the greatest impact on my teaching. And that's because it shows impactful instructional strategies, powerful technology tools, and the exact step-by-step process you need to take in order to implement those strategies and use those tools. So it's an awesome book that I would recommend to any teacher who's interested in learning how to meaningfully integrate technology in their classroom. If the ideas in this book sound interesting to you, then you might want to check out our brand new free course, How to Become a 21st Century Teacher. Through hands-on activities, we'll start to explore how we can actually take these theories and put them into action. And again, if you're interested in checking it out, it's totally free, and I put the link in the video description.